Welcome. I'm David Schneider, a professor of music at Amherst College and the resident musicologist of the Pioneer Valley Symphony. Tonight's concert has three wonderful pieces: Rossini's Overture to the Barber of Seville, Mary D. Watkins' Soul of Remembrance, and Schubert's Great C Major Symphony. I'm going to begin with just a few words about the Rossini, then we're going to cut to my having a lovely conversation with Mary D. Watkins, and then we'll come back to me for some more comments about the Schubert Symphony. Rossini's Overture to the Barber of Seville, I think, has to be understood in the context of Rossini's life. Rossini was, from the youngest of ages, absolutely part of a professional musical life. His father was a professional horn player and a town trumpeter, and his mother was an opera singer. And little Rossini would go off with the family on the tours that his mother was on and the traveling opera companies in northern Italy. And already by the age of 9, he was playing viola in the pit. You cannot imagine how immersed he was in music. This isn't like he had lessons twice a week. He had lessons almost 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Okay? So he was already a professional repetiteur. That means he was playing the keyboard for training singers how to sing an opera already at age 12. By 18, he left the conservatory with a whole other round of accomplishments. He began writing operas at the age of 19, and he wrote 39 of them, sort of in the next 19 years. Boom, he retired from opera composition. He was doing this so fast and so proficiently, and things were just so hectic in this music production world of opera making, that if he had written something that he liked, and it was part of a production that failed, he just went right back and took it and put it into the next production. That's what happened to the overture that we know as the Overture to the Barber of Seville. It started off as the Overture to one opera from 1813. That was a flop. He loved the overture. He took the overture. He dumped in on his next opera. That one was also a flop. He took it off there, put it at the head of the Barber of Seville. It's now his most beloved orchestral piece. I want to tell you just quickly what the formula was that Rossini used for his overtures. Almost all of them are the same, and Schubert also used this when he wrote an overture in the Italian style, which happened to be the first public performance of an orchestral piece of Schubert's when he was 21. So Rossini would start with a slow introduction, and that slow introduction would always have a surprise. And the surprise was to get people to pay attention and to quiet down, okay? Because they were a bunch of rambunctious Italian opera fans. All right. Then it would eventually, after giving the woodwinds a solo or two in the slow introduction, it would go into a first theme. First theme, almost always in those days, in the violins. Okay. Then you gotta do you gotta move to another key. You put in a storm so people won't notice that you're moving to another key. Then you get to the other key, and then you bring in your woodwind solos. So, okay, woodwind players live for Rossini's solos from this time. And then you hit him with another right-left jab, and that is a Rossini crescendo. Repeating, 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 repeating until it gets really loud, and that's it. That's all your material that you need for your overture, but you need a little more time, so you do a quick turnaround, and you do everything except for that slow introduction again, but you leave out the storm that causes the modulation between the first theme and the woodwind theme, the second theme, and you get it done and wrap it up really quickly. And by the way, don't forget to do a really fast ending at the end so the orchestra gets some solo applause before the curtain goes up on the singers. That's a Rossini overture. They're brilliant. They're lots of fun. Musicians love to play them. Bugs Bunny loves to do cartoons to them, and audiences love them. I'd now like to share with you some excerpts from my conversation with Mary D. Watkins. Welcome, Mary D. Watkins, to the Pioneer Valley Symphony. We are so glad to have you on our concert this evening, and wonderful to be talking to you now over Zoom. Thank you for agreeing to speak with us. I thought we might begin with the question, where does this piece, Soul of Remembrance, come from? What is its genesis?
Well, thanks, first of all, for having me. I'm really pleased that this piece is getting so much play. Soul of Remembrance is the second movement of 5 movements in color. And there's two versions. There's the full orchestra and there's the chamber orchestra. It comes from the long journey from the African continent to this, to the American, to the United States. And it's, after landing here, people were separated from everything they knew. They're separated from family, friends, and in lots of cases, they didn't even speak the same language, but now they were together and had to learn how to communicate and work together and really work for each other. So the thing is, there was a thread that just ran through this whole thing. It's there's sorrow. There's a lot of sorrow. Obviously, there has to be, but there is hope, and I think that's the thing that really this is about. It's about putting one foot in front of the other, taking that long march. You don't know how long it's going to be, but putting one foot in front of the other, and with the hope that there will be some kind of deliverance, that there will be some relief. I want to say there's another word I'd rather say, but I can't think what it would be. But definitely, they were under extreme stress. And so, there's that soul remembrance that enables them to get together, even though they were from sometimes different countries, different languages, and express the hope and that propelled them forward. It's a movement of, it's a movement of going forward, moving forward.
So to my mind, for our audience members that may have not heard the piece before, one of the striking qualities about this piece is just the beauty of the melody, and that melody just enfolds in sort of very natural but also not predictable ways over the entire piece. And underneath the melody is a constant pulse of harmony. And I'm wondering if that constant pulse of harmony is relating to some of what you're saying about the meaning of this piece.
Absolutely. It's about moving forward together. And the harmonies are very simple. It's just a matter of how how they're being used, which is probably not that unusual, but the melody you'll hear this melody as the xylophone in the very first movement, and it's when it shows up again in the second movement, it's very different. It's slowed down. It's extended. And this was pointed out to me by another conductor. He said that, I don't know, he might have read this somewhere, that this was kind of a takeoff of the old spiritual Remember Me. And at the time, it was certainly not, that isn't what I was thinking. I was trying to work with that initial motive, you know. But the melody is one of longing. And in the old hymn, Remember Me, is one of sorrow. And there's, you know, sorrow is not the same as, say, depressed, or it's not exactly the same. This is a sorrow, but there is hope, and there is there is a moving beyond the present condition.
You know, in terms of moving beyond the present condition, one thing that strikes me about the piece is the way it ends with those high violins joined by flute and that long fade out. I wonder what meaning that might have for you, if that has a meaning connected to the rest of the piece.
Well, in a way, it's eternity, you know, time. It's not over. That's kind of what it means to me. We go forward out of this place, and not forgetting where we've come from, but you know, it's not over. We're moving forward. We're still moving. We don't know what's ahead, but we have great hope. We have faith. Faith is involved. There's hope. Faith are not exactly the same, and both things are operating.
One thing that I wanted to broach with you is, when you and I were talking informally the other day, you told me that you almost didn't include Soul of Remembrance in this larger 5-movement piece, Movements in Color. Would you share with us why that was?
Yeah, I realized it was being what it was, very accessible, very relatable. You could feel it. And I felt like, golly, this is too accessible. This is too, you know, this is too direct. It should be a little more something else. And I'm really glad that I was compelled from within to include it. I had to. I mean, it was, you know, but I did go through that because there was a lot of pressure, you know, for contemporary composers to conform to a more complex, inaccessible kind of forms. And I just, I had to go with my heart. That's where.
Well, to my mind, that's what really comes through, is that this is a piece from the heart, and it brings into kind of sharp focus your story, the aesthetics of new music, and that it should make somebody feel uncomfortable to write from the heart in the way that you have. I think says, you know, much more about the contemporary music scene than sort of anything about you. But it, as you know, this has become sort of the favorite movement from the five movements in color. I think people like all of the movements, but you know, when the Seattle Symphony earlier this year decided to play a piece of yours, interestingly, it was this movement, I think, because it just speaks so directly to people.
And the thing is, it doesn't have any percussion in it. It's like a hymn almost, just the instruments, the melodic instruments.
You know, you're referring to a hymn leads me to another question that I wanted to ask you, which is the influence of church music, which is, I think, your first exposure really to music on your compositional output.
Well, yes, I didn't, it was the first music I remember hearing live, from a really little kid. And they used to have choir practice at our house. And at the time, my mother was the pianist. She was the church pianist. And so, we'd meet at our house, and I would sit there and listen to them, and I would get really into the music. We had quite a few really good singers. And one of my cousins was just really great harmony. Her alto would always cut through and enhance the melody. Sometimes we would do gospels, and I would really get off on that. I mean, I liked the rhythm, I liked the energy, but I did love the hymns as well. There was something about hymns that were stately and grand. Some of them were kind of not so interesting, but some of those hymns were wonderful.
Given your success in especially the women's jazz scene and funk and soul that we've just been talking about in the 70s and 80s, what drew you to orchestral composition and more classically oriented composition now in the present day and also since that time?
From the time I was really young, I was drawn to classical music, and this was always the goal. How do I get there? So I played jazz. I did jazz. I did, outside the women's community and in the women's community, all kinds of, kind of folk, all sorts of influences, because a lot of the music was folk music and pop. But there was that goal I wanted, it's like, okay, I'm doing this, and I enjoyed it and I liked it. But I knew that I had to get to that place where I'm going to write the things that are inside of me that I really want to say. It's kind of like that. I have something to say. I want to say it my way. And I've heard a little bit of it. I've heard it in other music, but I haven't heard it quite like I would like to say it.
I wonder if we might end with you telling us what you're either working on now or what your hopes for the future are for your work.
Well, I have there are some things that are lined up. And of course, like I said earlier, this is the music business, things change, but there are some things that are in line that I'm excited about. I can't really say what they are yet. And then, of course, I have composed the opera Emmett Till, and that is to be premiered in New York in March of 22. I think it's March 24th, 23rd and 24th. And there'll be more information about that as time goes. But I'm always going to write, I think. I probably will always do it anyway. But I have, like you said, there's been a lot of interest And so I'm looking forward to the future because I think it's going to be exciting. So, I try to eat right and take care of myself so that I can do these things. I'm very excited about it.
Well, that just sounds wonderful. For those of us within shooting distance of New York, like myself, I'm going to put now Emmett Till on my calendar. That sounds like something I wouldn't want to miss. I want to thank you so much for talking with us and so much for sharing your music with us. This is just a real privilege. So thank you from everybody at the Pioneer Valley Symphony.
Thank you so much.
So the third piece on today's program is Schubert's great C major symphony, known as the Ninth Symphony. And I want to tell you how we came to know it, why we still have it with us today. And to understand that, we have to go kind of back and understand Schubert as a symphony composer. And he was a prolific symphony composer, writing 6 symphonies by the time he was in his very early 20s. By the way, that was by the time Beethoven had written all of 0 symphonies. So in that respect, he was quite precocious, doing quite well. But all of those symphonies that he wrote earlier were intended for amateur orchestras to basically read and have as entertainment in their reading of them. By the way, Schubert had a string quartet in his family. His father played cello, 2 older brothers played violin, he played the viola, and so they would read string quartets. They would not read Beethoven string quartets, they were much too hard. They would read perhaps Mozart, perhaps Haydn, but more likely all kinds of what we would now call Kleinmeisters, Joseph Eiberle, and these kinds of people who were around Vienna, respected professional composers, but not charging into new territory the way Beethoven had, writing music for amateur consumption. So this string quartet of the Schubert family, nobody was a professional musician except for Schubert, only in his 20s when he started to publish music. Everybody else was school teachers and pretty impoverished, although reasonably educated. So this string quartet formed the basis of an amateur orchestra. And that amateur orchestra met, once a week for a number of years running. And they had other cellos, violas, violins, some winds, everything, basically stuffed into some relatively rich guy's relatively big living room and just playing for themselves. So that was the context for almost all of Schubert's first 6 symphonies, except for the first 2 of those, which he actually wrote for his high school orchestra. So he went to kind of an elite private high school that he went there on a scholarship. It was really the only way, the scholarship that he got, to get a really high-level education in Vienna outside of being an aristocrat. So he wasn't an aristocrat, came from a very modest background, but luckily had access to this really nice education. And by the way, I'm going to go on a little tangent, tell you how he got there. He got there because at age 7, he auditioned for Antonio Salieri as a little singer boy. Singerknaben is what they would have said in Vienna. And he had a beautiful voice, so he was admitted to be able to be one of those boys who would sing for the Imperial Chapel. And with that singing arrangement also came an invitation to go to this school, which he went to for a number of years, but he never absolutely completed because he bailed ship at a certain point in his late teens to go off and be more of a musician, and for reasons that are a little not well understood, also to work in his father's school. Well, he probably needed a job, and that was the job he could get. Didn't like it so much, left a little bit later. Okay, to get back to the C major symphony. So we've got all these amateur symphonies that have been played in this amateur way, or maybe not amateur symphonies, they're by Schubert, but they weren't intended for posterity. They weren't modeled on Beethoven, who was writing in a more difficult modern style. They were more Haydn, Mozart-esque. He gets into his early 20s, symphonic writing all of a sudden becomes much harder for him because he starts having much bigger ambitions. He wants in some way to be able to match Beethoven and at the same time not imitate Beethoven. At this point, he starts starting symphonies, writing a movement, 2 movements, 3 movements, never finishing them, never fully orchestrating them, never deciding that they are the thing that he really is tied to and going to finish. We don't know why he put so many of them aside. He only finishes 1 of the 5 symphonies that he begins, and that's what becomes the great C major symphony that we're going to hear tonight. And he does this in 1825, which is, by the way, a year after Beethoven's last symphony, a year after Beethoven's 9th. So Schubert writes this huge, new, path-breaking symphony, and he has no way of getting it performed because it takes a lot of money, a lot of backing to put up a professional performance. And there weren't standing orchestras just sitting around waiting for people to give them symphonies to play. There were opera orchestras, those were the professional orchestras, and occasionally they would step out and do a concert, or occasionally somebody like Beethoven would get a lot of nobles together who would provide a lot of money to put up a concert so he could perform his symphonies, but this was not a very common occurrence. So Schubert sees this big work of his. He knows he doesn't have the money to hire an orchestra for it. So he gives it to the Society of Friends of Music. The Society of Friends of Music was this very elite group of musicians and music lovers that would put on concerts and would help composers by putting on concerts of their music, but also by having their scores preserved and parts made out of the scores and this kind of thing. They were quote unquote amateur, which in that time meant that it wasn't composed of musicians who really needed to earn their living at music. So you could be a very accomplished pianist, say, or a very accomplished violinist, but as an aristocrat, you would never stoop to doing it for money. So had a lot of good musicians in it, but not many musicians that had to do it to make a living. Now, luckily, Schubert had been admitted. He hadn't been admitted the first time he applied. They said he was not an amateur musician, which was crazy because he was an amateur musician at the time he first applied. But what they meant is he wasn't of the social standing that they required to be a member. But later on, he acquired that social standing by virtue of getting better and better known among musicians in Vienna. So now Schubert's a member of the society. In a few years, they would actually make him part of the governing board of the society, so they really respected him. But at that point, he gives it to them with a dedication to the Friends of Music. They say, thank you very much. Here's a little honorarium, not enough to put it on or anything, and we'll, by the way, copy out parts for you, and we'll arrange for a reading by some musicians. So they do put together, not a concert, but a reading of this symphony, and from what we can tell, they didn't play all of it. They played, I don't know what they played, actually. Nobody knows, but it doesn't seem like they played the entire thing. So Schubert got to hear kind of a mediocre rendition of it, kind of, once. Then that was the end of that. Schubert went on to do other things. The symphony was more or less forgotten. When Schubert died at the age of 31 of syphilis, in his delirium on his deathbed, he seems to have said to his brother Ferdinand, his older brother, that he wanted to be buried next to Beethoven. So that's in fact more or less what happened. Now it so happens that the grave directly next to Beethoven's was already taken. Beethoven had only died a year before. Not that many people had been buried in the cemetery, but somebody had been buried next to Beethoven. So Ferdinand did sort of the next best thing. He buried him like 2 or 3 graves over. Okay. That is in 1828. In 1838, Robert Schumann, German composer, great writer on music, comes and visits Vienna, and he decides to go pay his respects to Beethoven's grave. Goes out to the cemetery, pays his respects to Beethoven, and what do you know? What does he find there? Hey, Schubert's only a couple of graves over. He pays his respects to Schubert, too. He didn't know Schubert as a symphonic composer, by the way. He only knew him for his songs. Maybe some of his piano pieces, but primarily for his songs, his lieder. So Schumann's walking back from the cemetery, and he's thinking to himself, how can I talk to somebody who knew Schubert? He only died 10 years ago. And he goes, oh, I think I remember. He had an older brother. He was kind of an amateur composer, too, and I think a schoolmaster. I wonder if I can get in touch with him. He figures out how to get in touch with Ferdinand Schubert. He's invited over to his house, and there he's let in and shown a whole bunch of scores. Schumann is amazed. He did not know that Schubert had written a great big symphony. And so he's completely taken with it, and he asks Ferdinand, can I take this? Ferdinand says, well, I'd like to hang on to it. Why don't you go ask the Friends of Music for their copy of the score? So he goes over to the Friends of Music, says, hey, I'd love to arrange for performances of this piece. Could I have the score? And, oh, you've got parts too. That's great. Bundles them all up. They give them to him, brings it back home to Germany, to Leipzig, where Mendelssohn is, and gives them to his friend Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn is not only a well-known composer, by the way, but also quite a good conductor, has a great orchestra. Mendelssohn arranges for the first performance of this piece. And it's a professional performance. So this is the last symphony that Schubert wrote, but the first one to get a professional performance. And then, shortly after that, the parts are actually published. So it's also the first symphony to be published. So that might be the end of the story, but it's not quite, because the symphony doesn't really get performed much. I don't know if there's one or two performances, but by and large, people take a look at the score, they say, this is too long, this is too hard, we're not interested, thank you very much. You have to remember, even in those days, say in the 1840s, a performance of a Beethoven symphony was not that common a thing yet either. They were starting to be performed, but they weren't in the circulation that they are today. So it basically languishes. In 1865, a kind of a miracle happens. Long lost in somebody's cupboard, they uncover the score to what we now know as Schubert's unfinished symphony. He only finished and orchestrated 2 movements of the 4 planned for the symphony. It was brought to Vienna, performed in 1865, and was a huge sensation. It wasn't as long. Of course, it only had 2 movements, not 4. And it wasn't as technically difficult as the C major symphony. So people loved to program it. It became very popular with orchestras across the world. So with the popularity of the unfinished symphony, which is, by the way, written before the great C major, people started to be interested in Schubert as a symphonic composer. Hey, does he have anything else? And the answer was yes, the great C major symphony. And at that point, starting in the late 1860s, that's how the great C major symphony entered the repertoire. I'm going to stop on the historical stuff right now, and I'll say just a few more words about its music at the piano. So musically, I want to begin in a slightly funny place. I want to begin by discussing Schubert and the trombone, because he's an innovative writer for this instrument. To understand how he's innovative, I need to play for you the opening theme of the introduction, which is played in the orchestra by 2 horns. So here it is. All right, a beautiful opening, perhaps inspired by the landscape and the cliffs where Schubert was writing this piece in the Austrian mountains. But what I want to tell you about it is that hidden within this is a motive. And that's what Schubert gives to the trombones throughout the main part of this first movement. So what I just played was the theme of the introduction. Normally, the theme of the introduction doesn't make its way into the main part of the movement, into the fast part, the allegro. Schubert never plays it all the way through in the allegro, but he does have the trombones as soloists play quietly behind really interesting other orchestral textures. In all kinds of interesting ways. Nobody had used the trombone in that kind of thematic way before. I hope that's an interesting thing for you to listen for. The next thing I want to point out is that there's a Hungarian element to the theme of the second movement. Here it is as it appears in the oboe in the beginning. And I'm just going to play that much for you right now, because the yappa-dappa rhythm is typically Hungarian, as is this interval, especially if it's repeated a lot. There's nothing unusual about a fourth, but the way it's combined with other typically Hungarian elements makes me think it's a Kuruc fourth, and that is a fourth that is associated with music that's associated with Kurucs, who were Hungarian freedom fighters in the 18th century. So we've got the dada rhythm and that upward fourth, and now I'm going to play it again, and on the last two pum-pums, I want you to think of Hungarian peasants in big boots going boom, boom. And that is what would have been going on there. So this innocent theme has lots and lots of Hungarian connotations in it. We don't know why Schubert did this here, but a year before, he had spent the summer being the music tutor of two young Hungarian noblewomen, the daughters of a count, Count Esterházy. It had been a pretty unhappy time for Schubert. We think he might have been in love with one of the sisters. It was not returned, that love. To me, there's a little element of nostalgia. I'm going to skip over the third movement and just show you for one moment something that happens in the middle of the fourth movement. I just played for you a theme that appears in the clarinet, pianissimo, as if it's kind of a secret. Well, many of you may have heard that before. What I just played for you, which should sound awfully similar, is the theme to the Ode to Joy from the last movement of Beethoven's Ninth. Again, why did Schubert do this? We don't know, but certainly he was tipping his hat to Beethoven.